I found letters from my mother-in-law that revealed her own son. My husband was isolating her and making her seem mentally unstable to control her assets. And what I did with this information shocked everyone. Before I start telling this story, I'm asking you to write in the comments what city you're listening from. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel. That way, you help me keep growing and bring increasingly emotional story and impactful story. Continuing with the account, and so you can understand better. I'll tell you how it all started. You know that story you hear about someone and without even really knowing them, you already form an opinion. Well, that's exactly what happened to me with Helen Brooks. When I married Mark and came to live in Willow Creek, Pennsylvania, it didn't take long for the neighbors to start warning me about my mother. That woman is difficult, some would say. She's not right in the head, others would whisper. And worse, my own husband reinforced that image every time someone touched on the subject. It was like everyone had agreed that Helen was a lost cause, a confused and emotionally unstable elderly mother who was better kept at a distance. I listened to everything in silence, without questioning much at first. But something inside me felt uneasy with those conversations. The house where Helen lived alone was an old construction, one of those full of stories in the walls and creaks in every step. Every time I went to visit her, I felt a discomfort I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't exactly fear, but a strange mix of pity and curiosity. The house seemed alive somehow, as if it kept secrets between its old boards and dusty windows. Helen spent her days in that place, surrounded only by memories and the heavy silence that filled each room. They said she talked to herself, that she made things up, that you couldn't trust what came out of her mouth. But when I looked into that woman's eyes, I saw something that didn't match at all with the crazy reputation everyone attributed to her. There was a lucidity there, a brightness in her eyes that wasn't confusion, but of someone who was trapped, suffocated by something invisible. I noticed how she became tense when Mark showed up, how she measured each word before speaking, how she trembled slightly when he interrupted her, and he always interrupted. Every time Helen tried to tell something, there came my husband with that overly patient tone, almost condescending, saying his mother wasn't well today, or that she was confusing things again to others. Mark was the exemplary son, the one who took care of his difficult mother with the patience of a saint. But to me, who lived with him every day, it was starting to sound artificial. Even the visits to Helen's house became a kind of uncomfortable ritual. Mark always insisted on going along, never let me stay alone with her for long. He said it was for my own safety, that his mother could have an episode and I wouldn't know how to handle it. But the truth is, Helen never had any episode in front of me. She was quiet, observant, always with that attentive look that gave me the impression she was analyzing every move, every word. Sometimes, when Mark left the room for a moment, she'd open her mouth as if she were going to say something important, but would quickly fall silent when she heard his footsteps returning. It was frustrating to see that this woman clearly wanting to communicate but being constantly silenced. The neighbors had their own stories about Helen. The lady from number 23 said she had yelled at the mailman for no reason at all. The couple from the corner swore she called in the middle of the night, making crazy accusations. Each person had their version of the unstable woman, and all these stories added up, creating a pretty convincing narrative. But you know what I found strange? All these stories came filtered through Mark. It was always him telling them, always him apologizing for his mother, always him reinforcing that she was getting worse with age. Nobody had ever witnessed these things directly, or if they had, they didn't remember the details clearly. It was all very vague, very based on what my husband said. I started paying more attention to the little things during our visits. The way Helen would shrink when Mark raised his voice, even just a little bit. How she looked at me with an almost desperate intensity when he wasn't looking. How her hands trembled when she signed papers that Mark brought just to organize her things. I wasn't foolish. I'd grown up in a complicated family and knew how to recognize strange dynamics when I saw one. All of that didn't smell right to me, but I also didn't know exactly what was wrong. It was like trying to assemble a puzzle without having all the pieces, only knowing that the final image wasn't what they were telling me it was. One afternoon, while Helen was making tea in her old kitchen, I noticed a framed photo on the wall. It was of her younger, radiant, holding a baby in her arms, Mark, presumably. In that photo, she had a wide, genuine smile, eyes full of life and hope. The contrast with the faded woman I saw now was striking. What had happened over the years to transform that vibrant woman into this almost ghostly figure who walked on tiptoes in her own house? I asked Mark about it on the way back, and he shrugged, saying that life had been hard on her and that some people just don't age well mentally. The answer was too quick, too automatic, as if he'd already rehearsed it for any question of that type. It was around that time I started seriously questioning whether that crazy reputation hadn't been built on purpose. It seemed like an absurd idea at first, almost conspiratorial. Who would do such a thing to their own mother? But the more I thought about it, the more the pieces started fitting together in a different way. Mark controlled everything in Helen's life, finances, the visits, even who could call her. He always had an explanation for this. Of course, he was protecting his mother, preventing her from being taken advantage of by ill-intentioned people. But what if the person Helen needed to be protected from was precisely her son? What if that unstable reputation was just a smokescreen to hide something much more sinister? I knew I was treading on dangerous ground with these thoughts. Mark was my husband, the father of my children, and questioning his integrity was questioning the entire structure of our life together. But I also couldn't ignore that discomfort growing inside me every time we visited Helen. There was something deeply wrong with that situation. Something that went far beyond a daughter-in-law, simply not getting along with her mother. It was deeper, darker, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more that feeling consumed me. I started dreaming about the old house, about Helen's attentive eyes following me, as if she were silently begging for help. After one of those particularly tense visits, where Mark practically dragged his mother away from me in the middle of a conversation, I stayed awake all night. My husband slept peacefully beside me, but I couldn't turn my head off. I kept replaying each interaction, each exchanged look, each word cut in half. Helen had tried to tell me something that day, I was sure of it. Something important, something Mark didn't want me to know. The question that kept me awake was simple, but frightening. How far would a son go to control his own mother? And more importantly, what would I do if I discovered my husband was capable of something truly terrible? The next day, during breakfast, I observed Mark with different eyes. He was reading the newspaper, relaxed, commenting on local news as if nothing had happened. But I could no longer see just the attentive husband and dedicated son. I was starting to see the cracks in the perfect facade he maintained, and an uncomfortable certainty was forming inside me. That story of Helen Brooks, the woman everyone avoided, had many more layers than anyone in Willow Creek imagined. And I was about to discover that, sometimes, the most dangerous person isn't the one everyone calls crazy, but the one who convinces everyone that someone else is. You ever notice how some people have the gift of speaking for everyone except themselves? Well, Mark had that gift to the extreme when it came to Helen. Every time we visited that old house and she tried to start a sentence, there came my husband with that soft interruption, almost affectionate. But that cut off any attempt of hers to express herself. "Mom, you're confused again," he'd say with a patient smile. Or then, "Let me explain this better. You know how nervous you get when you try to tell things?" And Helen would simply fall silent, as if she'd been trained to accept that her own words had no value. It was painful to watch, but at first I thought he was just trying to spare his mother some embarrassment, But then I started paying attention to the pattern. It didn't matter, the subject. Didn't matter if it was something simple like what she'd eaten for lunch or something more complex like an old memory. Mark always found a way to take control of the narrative. He had ready answers for everything, explanations that seemed to make sense on the surface, but when you stopped to think properly, didn't hold up very well. Like that time Helen tried to tell me about a discussion she'd had with her doctor, and Mark immediately said she had misinterpreted the conversation, that the doctor had actually been super attentive. How did he know? If he wasn't even there. But nobody questioned, because after all, Mark was the dedicated son who took care of his difficult mother. The control he exercised went far beyond conversations. Mark had access to all of Helen's bank accounts, paid all her bills, decided when she needed to go to the doctor and which doctor she should see. He said it was necessary because she no longer had the capacity to manage these things alone. But I'd seen Helen do complex crossword puzzles, remember important dates, and maintain perfectly coherent conversations when Mark wasn't around. That woman didn't seem incapable of anything. Actually, she seemed imprisoned, and the more I observed, the clearer it became that Mark had built a kind of bubble around his mother, where he controlled all information that entered and left. The visits Helen received were rare and always supervised. Mark explained it was to protect his mother from people who could take advantage of her or get her agitated. But in practice, this meant nobody could have a real conversation with Helen without him being present. Even phone calls went through a kind of filter. Once, I caught Helen answering the phone in the kitchen, and before she could say more than hello, Mark was already beside her, extending his hand asking for the device. "Let me answer, Mom. You know how confused you get on the phone," he said, and she handed it over without questioning. The fear in her eyes at that moment was unmistakable, and I finally understood it wasn't confusion, it was Tejo. Mark's patience was almost supernatural, and that started bothering me deep. He never yelled, never lost his composure, always maintained that calm, controlled tone. But you know when you realize someone's calmness isn't natural, it's calculated. That was exactly the feeling I had. Each of his words seemed to have been weighed and measured before leaving his mouth. Each gesture seemed rehearsed. He was too perfect, too attentive, too worried. To everyone in Willow Creek, Mark Brooks was the example of a son any elderly mother would want to have. But to me, who saw the backstage of this performance, it was starting to become clear that all of that was exactly that, a carefully orchestrated performance. There was a day that especially marked me. We were all three in Helen's living room, and she started talking about a property that had belonged to her late husband, something about some land in the interior that was worth good money. She'd barely started explaining when Mark interrupted, saying those lands had been sold years ago and that she was mixing up the times again. Helen turned red, opened her mouth to contest, but then simply gave up and lowered her head. Later, when we were alone in the car, I asked Mark about the land. He changed the subject so quickly I almost got whiplash. "My mother makes up a lot of things. Laura, you need to learn to filter what she says," was all he responded, with that tone that made it clear the subject was closed. I started doing a mental exercise every time we visited Helen. I imagined what she'd be trying to say if she could speak freely, without fear of being interrupted or corrected. What stories would she tell? What truths would she reveal? The frustration of seeing that woman constantly silenced grew inside me like a pressure with no escape valve. And worse is that nobody else seemed to notice. The neighbors, the acquaintances, even the health professionals who occasionally examined Herevia accepted Mark's narrative without question. After all, why would they doubt such a dedicated son, so present, so obviously concerned with his mother's well? But I had started to doubt, and that doubt was like a seed that wouldn't stop growing. Each visit brought a new piece of the puzzle, a new observation that didn't fit the official story. Like the time I noticed Helen became particularly nervous when Mark handled certain documents in front of her, or when I realized she ate very little at meals when he was present, but accepted second portions when it was just the two of us. Small signs that something was deeply wrong. That dynamic between mother and son was much more sinister than it appeared. And the question that wouldn't stop, what exactly was Helen trying to say, and why did Mark go to such lengths to make sure nobody heard her? One night, after another of these tense visits, I dreamed about Helen. In the dream, she was trapped inside a glass box, banging on the transparent walls and screaming, but no sound came out. Mark was on the outside, smiling that calm smile of his, explaining to a crowd of people that his mother was having one of her episodes and that it was better not to pay attention. I woke up sweating, with my heart racing, and the feeling of urgency that took over me was overwhelming. There was a woman being systematically silenced, and I was watching it all happen in slow motion, unable to do anything because I had no proof. Had nothing concrete, just an increasingly strong intuition that I was witnessing a total and continued humiliation. What distressed me most was thinking about how long this had been going on. How many years had Helen been interrupted, corrected, discredited? How much of her own story had been rewritten by Mark's version? And the most frightening question of all, if he was capable of doing this to his own mother, the woman who had raised and loved him unconditionally, what else would he be capable of? I looked at the man I'd married, with whom I'd built a life, and started to realize that maybe I'd never really known him. The mask was starting to crack, and what I was beginning to see behind it terrified me more than I was ready to admit. The news came suddenly, without prior warning, the way Mark liked to do things. Helen had suffered a small stroke, nothing too serious, according to the doctors, but enough to worry everyone. I found out when Mark came home that night, with an expression that tried to seem worried but had something more behind it, something I couldn't completely decipher. Mom had an episode today, he said, using that vague term that could mean anything. We went to visit her in the hospital the next day, and she was fine, a little more fragile perhaps, but talking normally and even joking with the nurses. She didn't seem like a woman who needed drastic changes in life, but Mark already had other plans. Less than a week later, he announced he was going to put Helen's house up for sale. She can't live alone anymore, Laura. You saw what happened, he argued, as if the stroke were definitive proof of total incapacity. I tried to suggest other alternatives: hire someone to help with daily tasks, install some monitoring system, even have her come live with us for a while. But Mark had a ready answer for each suggestion, always ending with the same conclusion. The house needed to be sold, and quickly. His rush bothered me deeply. Why such urgency? Helen had barely left the hospital, and he was already talking with realtors, scheduling appraisals, organizing paperwork. It was as if he'd been waiting for this moment, for this perfect excuse. That house was everything Helen truly had of her own. It was the only significant asset in her name, the only thing that represented some independence, some vestige of the life she'd built with her husband before he passed away. And Mark wanted to sell everything in a matter of weeks. It's for her own good, he repeated whenever I questioned. The money will be used to pay for a good nursing home, a place where she'll have proper care. But something in the way he talked about this money, about all these plans, didn't convince me. It seemed less about caring for his mother and more about, what, control, money, or both. I didn't know yet, but the bad feeling in my stomach only increased. Helen received the news of the sale with a resignation that broke my heart. She didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't protest, just nodded when Mark explained the plans to her, as if she'd already learned that resisting was useless. But I saw something in her eyes at that moment, a mix of sadness and something deeper, more frightening, kind of silent desperation of someone who knows they're losing the last battle. Mark scheduled a day for us to go there and organize some personal objects, separate what would be kept from what would be donated or thrown away. He said I could go alone if I wanted, that he had work meetings that afternoon. It was the first time in a long time he let me go to Helen's house without supervision, and that in itself was strange. When I arrived that October afternoon, the house was immersed in that golden light of late afternoon that entered through the dusty windows. But there was nothing welcoming about that light. It only made everything more melancholic, more charged with finality. Each room seemed to whisper stories of an entire life that was about to be dismantled and distributed in cardboard boxers. I started upstairs, opening closets and drawers, trying to decide what Helen would like to keep. But it was an impossible task, because how do you summarize someone's life in a few boxers? How do you decide which memories deserve to be preserved and which can be discarded? With each object I picked up an old photo, a dress stored for decades, a set of porcelain that had probably been a wedding gift. I felt the weight of that real story being erased. The whole house had a heavy, even oppressive climate. It wasn't just the natural sadness of a place being prepared for the end. It was something more visceral, more present. It was as if the walls had absorbed years of tension, of unspoken words, of suffocated fears. I walked from room to room and couldn't get rid of the feeling I was being watched, not by a supernatural presence, but by the very history of that place that refused to be forgotten. The creaks of the old floor seemed louder that day, each one sounding almost like a protest against what was happening. And Helen, who had come up with me to help but wasn't helping much, just watched everything with that attentive and silent look I'd already learned to recognize. We spent hours in that painful process of dismantling a life. Helen pointed to some things she wanted to keep, almost always items without financial value, but loaded with emotional meaning. A music box that didn't play anymore, a shawl that had belonged to her mother, faded photos of people I didn't know but who had clearly been important. It was emotional and devastating at the same time. Seeing that woman choosing the fragments of her own story she could still take with her to whatever the future held. And the whole time, I couldn't stop thinking about how Mark had made everything so easy, so inevitable. One small stroke, and there it was, an entire life being dismantled in a matter of weeks. When the sun started to set and the shadows became longer inside the house, I decided it was time for us to leave. It had been an emotionally exhausting day for both of us. I helped Helen down the stairs, holding her arm carefully, feeling how she was fragile but not as fragile as Mark made her seem. We were already at the door when she suddenly stopped, let go of my arm, and turned to look at the house one last time. Her face was serene, but her eyes shone with unshed tears. It was one of those moments when you feel something important is about to happen. You know, that feeling that the universe is holding its breath waiting for the next move. Then Helen did something completely unexpected. She held my hand with a surprising strength for someone everyone said was so weakened. Her fingers were cold but firm, and when she pulled me closer, I saw an intensity in her eyes I'd never seen before. It wasn't confusion, it wasn't senility, it was a crystalline and frightening lucidity. For a second, I thought she was going to thank me for helping with organizing things, or maybe apologize for the work I'd had, but it wasn't any of that. Helen leaned close to my ear, looked around quickly as if she wanted to make sure we were really alone, and whispered something that made my blood freeze in my veins. The words that came out of her mouth were few, but loaded with a meaning I still couldn't fully comprehend at that moment. But one thing was certain, they weren't words from a confused or unstable woman. They were words from someone who had something crucial to say, and knew this could be her last chance to say it. The way she looked at me after speaking, with that mix of fear and hope, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just any mother-in-law making a random comment. It was a warning. It was a cry for help in disguise. And I had just received the key to begin understanding that the entire story I knew about Helen Brooks and her dedicated son was much darker than anyone in Willow Creek could imagine. Don't trust everything my son says. The words left Helen's mouth in a whisper so low that for a second, I doubted if I'd heard correctly. My heart raced immediately. That feeling when you know you've just received information that's going to change everything, but still don't know exactly how. I looked into her eyes, searching for some sign of some evidence that this was just another of the episodes Mark talked so much about. But what I saw was the complete opposite. It was the most lucid woman I'd ever seen in my life, silently begging me to pay attention, to believe her when nobody else believed. Before I could respond anything, before I could ask any question, I heard the front door opening and Mark's familiar footsteps entering the house. He shouldn't have been there. He'd said he'd be in meetings all afternoon, which is why I could go alone to help with the organization. But there he was, arriving with that timing, too perfect to be coincidence. Helen let go of my hand immediately, as if she'd gotten a shock. And the fear that took over her face was so intense I felt it on my skin. "Hi, honey. I finished early and thought I'd stop by to see how you two were doing," Mark said with that casual tone that no longer fooled me. But his eyes weren't casual, they scanned the scene, analyzing our position, our proximity, trying to decipher if he'd missed something important. He knew. Somehow, he always knew when his mother tried to say something. Mark approached both of us with that smile I'd loved for so long, but that now gave me chills. "Mom, are you okay?" "You look tired," he said, placing his hand on her shoulder in a way that to any observer would seem affectionate, but that I now recognized as possessive, controlling. Helen nodded quickly, lowering her eyes, all that lucidity I'd seen seconds before disappearing behind a mask of submission. "Just a little tired, son." "It's been a long day," she responded with a small voice, totally different from the firm tone she'd used with me seconds before. Seeing that instant transformation was like watching someone turn off inside, and for the first time I truly understood the extent of the control Mark exercised over her. "Laura, you shouldn't let my mother get so tired. You know how she gets when she overexerts herself," Mark reprimanded me gently, but there was a sharp edge to those words. He was repositioning me, reminding me what my role was in that whole dynamic. I tried to protest, say that Helen had barely made any effort at all, that actually she'd spent most of the time just observing, but Mark had already taken his mother's arm and was guiding her to the living room, murmuring things about her needing to rest, about how he was going to make tea for her. I stood there in the hallway, still processing what had just happened, that warning echoing in my head, "Don't trust everything my son says." Later, when we were driving back home, I tried to touch on the subject subtly. "Your mother was quite lucid today. We talked a lot while organizing things," I commented, watching his reaction from the corner of my eye. Mark gave a short laugh, one of those that has no humor at all. "Ah, she has those moments, right? But don't be fooled, Laura. My mother is in decline. You saw how confused she got when I arrived, could barely form sentences properly." I hadn't seen any of that, but there was no point contradicting. Mark had already decided what the narrative was, and anything that didn't fit it would be reinterpreted until it did. "By the way," he continued, I think it's better you don't go there alone anymore. You never know when she might have another episode, and it would be dangerous for you. I realized there I'd crossed an invisible line by having that moment alone with Helen. By giving her an opportunity to speak without being immediately interrupted, I'd threatened the carefully constructed system Mark maintained. And now he was closing that breach, ensuring it wouldn't happen again. The feeling of helplessness that took over me was overwhelming. I'd finally received confirmation that something was terribly wrong. But what exactly? A vague warning wasn't enough. It wasn't proof of anything. Anyone I told this to would think I was exaggerating, seeing things where they didn't exist. After all, Mark was the exemplary son, Helen was the unstable mother, and I was, what? The meddling daughter-in-law who was creating problems where there were none. I spent the following weeks in a state of constant hypervigilance. Every conversation with Mark was analyzed, searching for inconsistencies. Every mention of Helen was processed and reprocessed in my head. And the more I paid attention, the more strange things I noticed. How Mark always had a ready story about his mother, but these stories changed subtly depending on who he was talking to. How he controlled not just her present, but was also rewriting the past, molding her narrative in a way that made her seem always a little less capable, a little less trustworthy. It was a total and systematic humiliation, so subtle it was almost imperceptible if you weren't looking for it. The sale of the house was advancing quickly. Mark had found an interested buyer, and the paperwork was being prepared. He seemed anxious to close the deal soon, always inventing excuses to speed up the process. The sooner we sell, the sooner Mon can settle in a place appropriate for her, he explained. But I noticed the real urgency behind those words. It was as if he were racing against an invisible clock, trying to complete something before someone, maybe me, maybe Helen herself, could intervene. Time was against the truth, and I felt this with painful clarity. If the house was sold, if Helen were placed in some institution where Mark would have total control over who visited her and when, that warning she'd given me would be the last spark of resistance that would die completely. It was around that time I started having recurring nightmares. I dreamed about Helen trapped somewhere, knocking on doors nobody opened, screaming truths nobody heard. I'd wake up in the middle of the night with my heart racing and the absolute certainty I needed to do something. But without having any idea what exactly. Mark slept deeply beside me, completely peaceful, completely convinced he was doing the right thing. Or worse, completely aware he was doing something wrong and simply not caring. I no longer knew which of the two options was more frightening. I looked at him in the darkness of the room and wondered who really was this man I'd built a life with, who I'd let into not just my house, but my heart. One afternoon, moved by an impulse I couldn't even explain properly, I grabbed the car keys and started driving. I hadn't warned Mark, hadn't planned, just left. And when I came to, I was parked in front of Helen's house. The for sale sign was already planted on the lawn, a cruel reminder that time was running out. I looked at that old house, with its windows that seemed like sad eyes and its walls that guarded so many secrets, and made a decision. I was going back there, alone, without Mark knowing. I was going to look for whatever it was Helen had tried to tell me that day, because a woman doesn't make a warning like that for nothing. A woman doesn't risk her son's wrath just to plant random doubts in her daughter. No, Helen had something specific to show me, something she couldn't simply say out loud, and I was determined to find out what. I went back to the house 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning, when I was sure Mark would be at work. I made up some excuse about having commitments around town, and he didn't even question Mosh after all. Why would he? I'd been the obedient wife for so long, never giving reasons for suspicion. But as I drove through the familiar streets of Willow Creek toward that old house, my heart beat so loud I could hear it in my ears. It wasn't exactly fear. It was that strange mix of adrenaline and determination you feel when you know you're about to cross a line from which there's no return. The for sale sign swayed slightly in the morning wind when I parked, as if welcoming me to this clandestine mission I could barely believe I was doing. The key Mark had given me weeks ago was still on my keychain. He'd forgotten to ask for it back. Or maybe simply didn't think I'd have the courage to come back alone. The click of the lock opening sounded too loud in the silence of that morning, and when I pushed the door, the familiar creak of the old hinges seemed like a cry of protest. The house was empty now. Helen had been temporarily transferred to a place Mark called assisted living while the sale was finalized. The silence was different from what I remembered. wasn't just absence of sound, it was absence of life, of human presence. But paradoxically, the house seemed more alive than ever, as if it were waiting for this moment, waiting for someone to finally pay attention to the stories its walls guarded. I stood in the entrance hall for a full minute, trying to decide where to start. What exactly was I looking for? I didn't even know for sure. Some clue? Some evidence? Something that made sense of that cryptic warning Helen had given me. I decided to start upstairs, in the bedroom where Helen had slept for so many years. The stairs creaked under my feet as I climbed, each step seeming like an announcement of my presence, even though there was nobody there to hear. The second-floor hallway was plunged in gloom, with sunlight struggling to enter through the heavy curtains nobody had bothered to open. It was oppressive and welcoming at the same time, that space loaded with decades of lived. Helen's room was Spartan now that most personal things had been removed. The bed was still there, and the old wardrobe, but the small objects that make a room truly personal had disappeared. I started cleaning almost automatically. It was my way of dealing with anxiety, doing something productive while my mind processed the absurdity of the situation. I wiped a cloth over the dusty surfaces, organized some boxers that were still against the wall, swept the floor. It was when I was passing the broom under the old dresser that I heard a different sound. It wasn't the normal creak of the old floor, it was something more hollow, looser. I stopped immediately, my entire body becoming tense with that accidental discovery. I knelt right there, running my hands over the wooden floor, trying to locate where that strange sound had come from. That's when I felt that one of the boards was visibly looser than the others, as if it had been lifted and replaced many times over the years. My heart raced again. That feeling you're about to discover something important, taking over my entire being. Carefully, I used a coin I had in my pocket to leverage the edge of the board, and it came loose surprisingly easily, revealing a hollow space underneath. And there, in the darkness of that improvised hiding place, was a bundle wrapped in cloth. A bundle that had clearly been placed there on purpose, hidden carefully from curious eyes or from specific eyes. My hands trembled when I picked up the bundle. It was lighter than I expected, but the emotional weight of that moment was crushing. I sat on the floor itself, with my legs crossed, and started unwrapping carefully. The cloth was old, yellowed by time, but still resistant. And when I finally removed the last layer, what I saw left me breathless. Letters. Dozens of them carefully folded and organized in chronological order, tied with thin string. Some had dates written in the upper corner, others didn't. But all had the same handwriting, trembling but legible. The writing of someone who was documenting something important, something that needed to be preserved at all costs. I picked up the first letter with an almost religious reverence. My fingers left marks on the old paper when I unfolded it, and the first line I read made me immediately understand why Helen had hidden all that. If someone is reading this, it's because I couldn't tell the truth alone. The letter began. Helen's voice seemed to jump from the paper, clear and lucid, completely different from the confused woman Mark always described. I could barely breathe properly as I continued reading, each word revealing a layer of truth that had been systematically suppressed, hidden, denied. These weren't the ramblings of an unstable woman. They were meticulous records of someone who knew exactly what was happening to her and who had decided to leave a trail, a real story that couldn't be erased so easily. I spent hours there, sitting on the floor of that empty room, reading letter after letter. Some were long, detailing specific events with dates and names. Others were short, almost like quick notes made in moments of desperation or clarity. But all of them painted the same disturbing picture, a woman being slowly and systematically isolated, controlled and discredited by her own son. Helen described with painful precision how Mark had started taking control of her finances to help, how he'd started accompanying her to all medical appointments out of concern, how he'd started intervening in all her conversations to protect her, and how, over the years, that protection had transformed into an invisible prison. One letter in particular left my eyes full of tears. In it, Helen described an incident where she'd tried to contest the sale of some investments Mark had made in her name. He'd been furious, not in the explosive way you'd expect, but in that cold, calculated way that was even more frightening. He'd said that if she continued causing problems, he'd be forced to seek a court order, declaring her incapable of managing her own affairs. And he'd made it sound like it was for her protection, like it was the most logical and loving thing to do. Helen wrote, I realized at that moment my son was willing to completely destroy me if I stood in his way. And I don't know how to stop this without losing everything. When I finally finished reading all the letters, the daylight was already starting to change, entering that golden phase of afternoon. I'd spent hours there, completely absorbed in that archive of pain and resistance Helen had built. The letters fell from my lap as I tried to process everything I just discovered. They weren't just evidence of financial control or emotional manipulations, were proof of a systematic campaign to erase a woman's identity, to steal not just her assets but her own voice, her own story. And the most terrifying of all, those letters proved Helen had never been crazy. She always knew exactly what was happening. The madness was just a convenient narrative Mark had built to justify the I got up from the floor with numb legs and a heavy heart. I gathered all the letters carefully, rewrapping them in the old cloth. But this time I didn't put them back in the hiding place. I was going to take them with me. They were Helen's voice, proof of her sanity, the real story she'd risked everything to preserve. I looked around that empty room one last time, and it was as if I could feel her presence there, silently thanking someone for finally having found that, for someone finally paying attention. I heard you, Helen, I whispered to the empty room, and I'm going to make everyone hear you too. It was a promise, not just to her, but to myself, because after reading those letters, after understanding the extent of that emotional story and devastating one, I knew there was no turning back. I'd crossed a line, and now I needed to decide what to do with the truth I'd just literally unearthed from under the floorboards. Sitting in the car, still parked in front of that house that now seemed to guard fewer secrets, I held the bundle of letters against my chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world, and it was, in a way. It was the voice of a woman who had been silenced for so long that everyone had forgotten she had something to say, but I couldn't read everything there, not with the possibility of Mark showing up at any moment, not with my emotional state so fragile. I drove home on autopilot, my mind spinning in 1,000 different directions, trying to process not just what I'd found, but what that meant for everything, for my marriage, for my own involuntary complicity in this whole story. When I got home, I confirmed Mark was still at work before locking myself in the office with those letters, ready to dive deeper into the truth Helen had preserved so carefully. The first thing that impressed me when rereading the letters more calmly was the absolute clarity of Helen's writing. There was no confusion, no contradictions, nothing suggesting mental instability. On the contrary, the organization was meticulous. The dates always noted when possible, the events described with specific details that only someone very lucid could record. In a letter dated 3 years ago, Helen described how Mark had insisted on accompanying her to a meeting with the family lawyer. During the meeting, he'd answered questions directed at her, had corrected information she tried to give, and in the end had gotten her to sign a power of attorney giving him total power over her finances. I knew it was wrong, Helen wrote, but he made it seem like I was being difficult, like I was hindering the process. The lawyer looked at me with pity, as if I were a stubborn child. Another letter detailed an even more disturbing incident. Helen had received a call from a distant cousin, someone she hadn't seen in years, but with whom she'd always maintained sporadic contact. They'd arranged lunch, and Helen was excited, was one of the few social activities she still had. But when Mark found out, he was visibly irritated. He didn't yell, didn't make a scene. That was never his style. Instead, he spent the following days making subtle comments about how that cousin had always been a gold digger, how she probably just wanted something, how Helen wasn't well enough to deal with manipulative people like that. On the day of the lunch, Helen woke up, determined to go anyway, but Mark had casually scheduled a medical appointment at the same time. I canceled the lunch, Helen wrote, and my cousin never called again. Now, I realized it was exactly what Mark wanted, to isolate me from anyone who might notice what was happening. The letters revealed a pattern so clear it was impossible to deny. Every time Helen tried to maintain some independence, whether financial, social, or even emotional, Mark found a way to intervene. And he always did it in a way that seemed reasonable on the surface, always wrapped in concern. And when Helen mentioned she wanted to hire someone to help with house maintenance, Mark said she was being deceived by opportunists and that he himself would take care of it. When she wanted to participate in a church group for seniors, he argued she'd get too tired and that those women just gossiped and created problems. Gradually, Helen's world had shrunk until it fit only within the walls of that old house, with Mark as the sole gatekeeper of the exit. But what shocked me most were the descriptions of how Mark manipulated other people's perception of Helen. He had a habit of telling stories about his mother's episodes that, according to the letters, had never happened the way he described. For example, there was a situation where Helen had questioned a strange charge on her credit card, a legitimate charge she didn't recognize. Mark had turned this into a story about how his mother was so confused she didn't even remember her own purchases anymore. He told this to neighbors, to doctors, to anyone who'd listen, always with that tone of genuine concern. He's rewriting my story. Helen had written, everything I do or say is filtered through the lens of instability he created. And the more he does this, the more people believe. One of the most recent letters, dated just a few months before the stroke, revealed that Helen had started suspecting Mark was, in fact, embezzling money from her. She'd managed to access some bank statements when he was traveling for work and had noticed large transfers to accounts she didn't recognize. When she confronted her son about this, he'd reacted with that frightening calmness that was already his trait. He explained they were investments he was making in her name, that she didn't need to worry about details because he was taking care of everything. And then he'd added, almost casually, that if she continued acting paranoid, he'd have to talk to the doctor about the possibility of her developing dementia. It was a veiled threat, Helen wrote, with more trembling handwriting in this letter. He was telling me that if I didn't shut up, he'd make me seem really crazy. Reading those words made me feel a rage I'd never felt before. It wasn't just moral indignation, it was something more visceral, more personal. Because I'd seen Helen shrink in her son's presence, had seen the fear in her eyes, and at the time I'd believed the narrative that this was a symptom of mental confusion. I'd been complicit, even unwillingly, in this total humiliation she suffered daily. How many times had I stayed silent when Mark interrupted his mother? How many times had I accepted his explanation without questioning? And how many times had I looked at Helen with that mix of pity and discomfort you feel when you think someone is mentally diminished? The guilt started mixing with the anger, creating an emotional cocktail difficult to process. But Helen hadn't kept those letters just to document what was happening to her. In the final pages, it became clear she had a bigger purpose. If someone finds this, one of the final letters said, know that I wrote everything consciously, with full mental capacity. These letters are my last form of defense. They're proof that I always knew what was happening, that I was never the confused woman my son insists I am. Maybe it's too late for me, but I hope this can help other elderly mothers who are going through the same thing. I hope someone believes me when I can no longer speak for myself. Reading those words was like receiving a punch in the stomach. Helen had hidden those letters knowing she might never be able to retrieve them, knowing her voice was being erased but refusing to let it be completely silenced. There were also passages where Helen reflected on how she'd arrived at that point. She wrote about how Mark had always been a difficult son, but that she'd attributed this to normal phases of growing up, how he'd become more controlling after his father passed away. But she'd thought it was just worry about her being alone, how she'd given him more and more access to her life, more and more control, because she trusted him, because he was her son, because she never imagined that boy she'd raised would be capable of doing something so cruel. I wonder where I went wrong, she wrote in a particularly painful letter. Was I too much of a mother? Did I give too much? Or was there always something in him I didn't want to see? Either way, now I'm paying the price for my blind trust. When I finished reading all the letters for the second time, it was already dark outside. I heard Mark's car arriving in the garage, and my entire body became tense. I quickly stored the letters in a drawer I knew he never opened, locking it with a key I always kept with me. My heart beat irregularly while I tried to seem normal, tried to recompose the facade of the wife who knew nothing, who hadn't discovered anything. Mark came into the house whistling, in a joyed mood, completely oblivious to the fact I'd just discovered who he really was. We had dinner together like we did every night, and I answered his questions about my day with lies that came out surprisingly, easily, from my mouth. But inside, I was changed, because now I knew the truth. And that truth wasn't just about Helen and Mark, it was about how easy it is to erase someone when you control the narrative. How simple it is to transform a lucid woman into a crazy one in the world's eyes. The letters had answered all the questions I had, but they'd also created a new one, much more urgent. What was I going to do with that information? Helen had risked everything to leave that record, had trusted that someone would eventually find it and believe. and that someone had been me. Now I carried not just the truth, but also the responsibility to do something with it. I could pretend I'd never found anything, go back to my comfortable life of purposeful ignorance, or I could use those letters to finally give Helen the voice she deserved, even if it meant destroying my marriage, facing Mark and the entire structure of lies he'd built so meticulously. As I lay in bed that night, with Mark sleeping peacefully beside me, I knew which choice I had to make. The letters weren't just paper and ink, they were the soul of a woman who refused to be completely erased, and I wasn't going to let her sacrifice be in vain. In the following days, I started testing Mark in subtle ways, asking seemingly innocent questions about Helen, about the house, about his plans for his mother. I wanted to see how he'd react, wanted to confirm if what I'd read in the letters was really the truth or if my mind was creating a distorted narrative based on paranoia. But each conversation only confirmed what Helen had documented so carefully. "Mark, do you think your mother is really that bad?" I asked one night during dinner, trying to sound casual. Like, couldn't she continue in her house with some help instead of going to an institution? The change in his face was instantaneous, even though he tried to disguise it. His jaw became tense, his eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second before he recomposed that mask of infinite patience. "Laura, we've already talked about this," he responded, and the tone was too controlled, too measured. "My mother doesn't have the conditions to live alone. You yourself saw how confused she gets. It would be irresponsible of us to leave her there." I insisted a little more, just to see how far he'd go, but she seemed fine when we went to organize things. She talked normally, remembered everything, ... Mark put his fork on the plate with more force than necessary, and for the first time I saw the mask really start to crack. "You don't live with her like I live with her," he said, and now there was a sharp edge to those words. "You see isolated moments. I see the complete picture. And the complete picture is of a woman who can no longer take care of herself, period." The period was particularly revealing. Mark wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by me, and that attempt to end the conversation authoritatively showed how much my questioning bothered him. I decided to back off at that moment, didn't want to raise suspicions before having a concrete plan of what to do with the letters. But that small interaction had given me everything I needed to know. Mark didn't tolerate anyone challenging his narrative about Helen. Any attempt to suggest she was more capable, claimed, was seen as a direct threat to the control he exercised, and he protected that control tooth and nail, even if in a veiled and superficially polite way. I started observing other behaviors that before seemed normal to me, but that now, under the light of what I knew, were clearly manipulative. Like how Mark always made a point of visiting his mother alone before we'd go together, to prepare her for company, as he said. Now I understood those visits were conditioning sessions, where he probably reinforced the narrative that she wasn't well, that she needed him for everything, that anything she said that contradicted this would be seen as a symptom of mental deterioration. He was constantly molding her perception of herself, making her doubt her own sanity. It's a type of abuse so subtle, it's almost invisible, but so effective it can completely destroy a person. One afternoon, I made another attempt to probe him, this time about Helen's finances. "Your father left quite a bit for her, right? With the sale of the house, she should be quite comfortable financially," I commented while we were folding clothes. Mark was quiet for a few seconds, too long for a simple question. "She has enough," he finally responded, without looking at me. "But you know how it is. Medical costs will increase as she ages, and quality nursing homes are expensive. I need to manage everything carefully to ensure she doesn't end up with nothing." The way he talked about managing her money, as if it were his to manage, gave me chills. According to Helen's letters, Mark had already transferred substantial amounts to his personal accounts, always with excuses about investments or urgent needs that were never completely explained. "And have you already decided which place she's going to stay?" I asked, pushing a little more. Mark finally looked at me, and there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Maybe I'd simply never paid attention. It was a coldness, a calculability that didn't match at all with the image of the worried son he projected. "I'm already looking at some options," he said. "Places where she'll have constant care, where she won't be able to do stupid things or hurt herself. Places where visits are controlled so as not to get her agitated." Those last words were the most revealing, controlled visits. He wasn't looking for a place where Helen could live with dignity and some independence. He was looking for a prison disguised as a health institution where he'd have total control over who saw her and when. It was at that moment Mark's artificial calmness really began to crumble. He must have realized I was questioning too much, that something had changed. "Why so much interest suddenly in my mother?" he asked, and the tone was accusatory now, without any attempt to disguise. "You were never very close to her before. Actually, you always agreed with me that she was difficult to deal with." Those words were like a slap in the face. Because he was right, I had accepted his narrative without questioning for so long, and he was using my own past complicity as a weapon against me. "Now, I'm just trying to help," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "She's my mother-in-law. I worry about her." Mark laughed, but there was no humor in that sound. "You worry now? How convenient." The mask had fallen completely, and what I saw now was the real Mark, not the dedicated son, not the attentive husband, but the man who had methodically orchestrated his own mother's destruction for personal benefit. He realized he'd shown too much and tried to back off, soften, return to the character he played so well. "Sorry, honey, I'm stressed with all this. It's hard to see my mother like this, you understand." But I didn't understand anymore, didn't believe anymore. Because now I saw the pattern with crystalline clarity whenever he was confronted or questioned. Mark first tried to disqualify whoever was questioning him, then played the victim, and finally returned to the role of suffering son who only wanted the best for his mother. It was a predictable cycle, once you knew what to look for. That night, lying in bed beside him, I realized with frightening clarity that my husband was capable of a cruelty I'd never imagined possible. It wasn't explosive cruelty. It wasn't physical violence. It was something much more insidious. It was the cruelty of slowly erasing someone, of stealing not just assets but a person's very identity, of making an elderly mother doubt her own sanity, of isolating her from anyone who could help her, of building such a convincing narrative that even health professionals believed it. And he'd done all this while maintaining the public image of exemplary son, receiving praise and admiration from everyone around. The hypocrisy was nauseating, but what most terrified me was thinking about what this meant for our relationship. If Mark was capable of doing that to his own mother, the woman who'd raised him, what would he be capable of doing to me if I stood in his way? And our children, what kind of man was this who was helping raise them? Helen's letters weren't just about her. I realized they were a warning, an alert that there are people capable of destroying even the most sacred bonds when there's something to gain, and who do it with a smile on their face and a ready excuse on the tip of their tongue. Mark had spent years building this perfect image, but I'd finally seen through it, and there was no way to unsee it anymore. There was no way to go back to the comfortable ignorance of before. I got up from bed carefully, not to wake him, and went to the office, where the letters were still stored in the locked drawer. I held them against my chest in the dark, feeling the weight of that responsibility that had fallen in my lap. Helen had trusted that someone would eventually find those words and do something. And that someone was me. I could no longer pretend I didn't know, could no longer be a silent accomplice to that emotional story and tragic one happening right under my nose. I looked out the window at the empty street, at that small town where everyone thought they knew everyone, where Mark Brooks was the example of a dedicated son and Helen Brooks was just the confused elderly mother. But I knew the truth now, and I had a crucial decision ahead: what to do with this truth in a way that could really make a difference, in a way that could give Helen back the voice Mark had worked so hard to silence. The decision to seek out a lawyer wasn't easy, but it was the only thing that made sense. I couldn't simply confront Mark directly. He was the expert at manipulating situations, at turning the game in his favor. I needed someone who understood the legal implications of what I'd discovered. Someone who could tell me if those letters really had the power I thought they had. I scheduled a consultation with Sarah Mitchell, a lawyer specialized in family law and abuse cases against the elderly, who had an office in downtown Willow Creek. I didn't tell Mark anything, of course. I made up an excuse about going to meet a friend for lunch, and he didn't even question much. He still hadn't realized I was already 3 steps ahead of him in that dangerous game. I'd started playing. Sarah's office was small but welcoming, with that smell of fresh coffee and old paper you find in law offices that really work, that aren't just a facade. She was a woman around 50 years old, graying hair tied in a bun, attentive eyes, that seemed to see through any lie. When I started telling the whole story from the beginning, from the first strange visits to the discovery of the letters, she listened without interrupting once. She just made occasional notes, nodded here and there, but mainly just listened. And when I finished, when I placed Helen's letters on the table between us, she picked up each one of them with an almost reverent care, as if she understood the weight of what she was holding. Sarah took almost 2 hours reading the letters. Sometimes she frowned, sometimes she shook her head, sometimes she made more notes. I sat there, drinking the coffee she'd offered, and that was already cold, anxious to hear the opinion of someone who really understood these things. When she finally finished and raised her eyes to me, I saw something that gave me hope for the first time in weeks. Determination. "Laura," she said, and her voice was firm, professional, but with a touch of badly disguised emotion. "This here is gold. Not in the financial sense, but in the legal sense. These letters are clear, consistent, dated. They show a pattern of behavior that extends over years. And most important, they show Helen Brooks was, and probably still is, in full mental capacity. The plan Sarah outlined was complex but necessary. First, we needed to suspend the sale of the house immediately, using the letters as evidence that Helen hadn't truly consented to that sale, that she'd been coerced or manipulated. Second, we needed to get an independent evaluation of Helen's mental state, not by doctors Mark chose or could influence, but by completely neutral professionals indicated by the court. Third, and most difficult, we needed to investigate Helen's finances. See exactly how much Mark had transferred to himself over the years. "It's going to be a battle," Sarah warned me. "Your husband built a very convincing narrative over years. He'll try to discredit you. He'll try to discredit the letters. He'll use every resource he has to maintain control. You need to be prepared for this." I was prepared, or at least I thought I was. Sarah filed an emergency petition in court that same week, attaching copies of all of Helen's letters. The sale of the house was suspended immediately, awaiting investigation. It was like throwing a bomb in the middle of Mark's carefully organized life. He came home that night absolutely furious, not that controlled anger I'd seen before, but genuine fury he could barely contain.
"What did you do?"
He practically shouted as soon as he came through the door. "How dare you interfere in my family's affairs without talking?" I kept calm, even with my heart racing. "Your mother is my family too," I responded, "and she deserves to be heard, deserves someone to believe her." The expression on Mark's face when he realized I knew that I really knew everything was something I'll never forget. It was like watching a mask literally shatter in real time. First came denial. "You don't know what you're talking about. My mother made these things up because she's confused." Then came the attempt at manipulation. "Laura, honey, you're being deceived. These letters don't mean anything. They're the ramblings of a sick mind." And finally, when none of that worked, came the barely disguised threat. "You're going to regret this. You're destroying our family because of my mother's fantasy." But I didn't back down. For the first time since I'd discovered the truth, I felt really strong, really convinced I was doing the right thing. Helen's psychiatric evaluation was scheduled for the following week, conducted by a team of 3 independent professionals who had no previous connection to her or Mark. Sarah told me this was crucial. Any evaluation done by doctors Mark had chosen would be automatically suspect. Helen was interviewed extensively, went through a battery of cognitive tests, had her memories and reasoning abilities evaluated in every possible way, and you know what they discovered? That Helen Brooks was in perfect mental capacity, that there were no signs of dementia, of Alzheimer's, of any type of significant cognitive deterioration. She had, according to the report, full capacity to understand and manage her own affairs, make informed decisions, and express her wishes in a clear and consistent manner. The report was devastating to the narrative Mark had built so carefully. Suddenly, years of stories about the confused mother, about the episodes, about the need for constant control of that started crumbling like a house of cards, and the people in town started noticing. They started remembering strange things, inconsistencies in Mark's stories. Times when Helen seemed perfectly lucid but he insisted she was having a bad day. The neighbor from number 23, who had spread that story about Helen yelling at the mailman, now remembered that actually it had been Mark who told that she'd never witnessed anything The couple from the corner started questioning whether those crazy nighttime calls had really happened, or if Mark had planted that idea in their heads. It was like watching a domino effect. Once the first piece fell, the independent evaluation proving Helen was lucidal, the others started falling too. The bank, where Mark had made the authorized transfers, started investigating these transactions more closely. The family lawyer who had prepared that power of attorney started wondering if he'd been coerced into accepting signature. Helen hadn't given freely. The nursing home Mark had chosen for his mother, one of those institutions where residents have very little contact with the outside world, suddenly seemed like a very suspicious choice. And Mark, who had spent years being Willow Creek's exemplary son, suddenly was being seen with different eyes. Skeptical, questioning eyes that were finally seeing through the performance he'd maintained for so long. But Mark didn't give up easily. He hired one of the best lawyers in the region, someone known for defending difficult cases and often winning against all odds. His lawyer tried to argue the letters were therapeutic fiction, that Helen had written that as a way to process irrational fears, not as documentation of real events. He tried to discredit the psychiatric evaluation, suggesting Helen had good days and bad days and that they'd casually caught her on a good day. He tried to paint me as a meddling daughter-in-law who was causing problems for personal reasons, perhaps even out of financial interest in Helen's inheritance. It was brutal, it was humiliating, and there were moments I thought about giving up. But then I remembered the letters, Helen's voice in those pages, and knew I couldn't stop now. The final twist came when the bank finally concluded its internal investigation. They discovered Mark had transferred more than $200,000 from Helen's accounts to his personal accounts over 5 years. Some transfers had documentation that seemed legitimate on the surface, but when you looked more closely, Helen's signatures were inconsistent. The dates coincided with periods where she was particularly vulnerable or under pressure. It was a clear pattern of misappropriation, of financial abuse, exactly what Helen had described in the letters. And suddenly, Mark was no longer the dedicated son. He was an ungrateful son who had systematically stolen from his own elderly mother while pretending to care for her. The entire town was shocked. How had they been deceived for so long? How had nobody noticed? Sarah called me one Friday afternoon with news I could barely believe. "Laura, we did it." The court formally declared that Helen Brooks is in full mental capacity. The sale of the house is definitely canceled, and Mark would have to answer criminally and civilly for the unauthorized transfer. I broke down in tears right there, in the middle of the living room, a mix of relief, exhaustion, and a deep sadness for everything that had happened, for everything Helen had been through. But there was also a sense of victory, of justice being done, of a voice that had been silenced for so long, finally being heard. Helen was going to be able to go back to her house. She was going to be able to control her own finances again. She was going to be able to finally live the rest of her life with the dignity she'd always deserved, but that had been stolen from her by her own son. I went to visit Helen that afternoon at the temporary assisted living where Mark had managed to place her while the house was being sold. When I told her everything that had happened, when I explained I'd found the letters and they'd changed everything, she cried. But they weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of pure relief, of validation, of finally being believed after years being treated as if her words had no value. "I knew," she whispered, holding my hands tightly. "I knew that if someone found those letters, they'd make a difference. I just didn't think it would be in time. Thank you for believing me when nobody else believed." And at that moment, I knew I'd done the right thing, no matter the personal cost, no matter what it meant for my marriage or my life. Because some things are more important than personal comfort. Some stories need to be told. Some truths need to come to the surface, no matter how buried they are. The day Helen was officially declared lucid and capable of managing her own affairs was a watershed moment. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was a restoration of dignity, a validation of years of silent suffering that had finally found a voice. I was at the hearing when the judge read the decision, and seeing Helen's face at that moment was something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. She didn't exactly smile, but there was a peace there, a kind of deep relief that only comes when you're finally believed after years being treated as if your words had no value. Mark was on the other side of the room, with his expensive lawyer, and the expression on his face was of pure shock. He'd been sure he'd win, sure his carefully constructed narrative would prevail. But Helen's letters, those pages she'd hidden under the old floorboards, had spoken louder than any story he could tell. The legal consequences for Mark started unfolding quickly after that here. The letters, combined with the bank records and Helen's testimony before the independent professional, formed a solid case of asset abuse and psychological manipulation. The district attorney decided to prosecute criminally, which meant Mark faced not just the loss of the money he'd embezzled, but potentially prison time. Sarah explained to me that cases like this were complicated because they often depended on proving malicious intent. But with the documentation, we had Helen's own voice describing the coercion, the veiled threats, the systematic isolation. It was hard to argue. Mark didn't know exactly what he was doing. He'd orchestrated everything with surgical precision, and that same precision now worked against him. The civil trial came first, and that's where the full extent of what Mark had done really came to light. For 3 days, we heard testimonies from bank employees who'd processed the suspicious transfers, from neighbors who now remembered strange interactions, from health professionals who admitted they'd perhaps trusted Mark's word too much without evaluating Helen independently. A nurse who'd visited Helen a few times confessed, with tears in her eyes, that she'd always thought the patient was much more lucid than the son described, but that she'd suppressed that intuition because the son seemed so dedicated, so concerned. It was painful to hear how so many people had seen small signs but chosen to ignore them because Mark had built such a convincing facade. That's the most frightening truth about this type of abuse. It thrives on respectability, on the benefit of the doubt we give people who seem to be doing the right thing. When it was Helen's turn to testify, the room fell into absolute silence. She walked up to the witness stand with firm steps, not the fragile, confused woman Mark had painted, but someone who'd survived years of systematic manipulation and still maintained her essence intact. Her voice trembled a little at first, but as she went on telling her story, the same story she'd written in those letters, but now out loud, to a room full of people who were finally truly listening, she became stronger, firmer. She described how the control had started subtly after her husband passed away, how Mark had gradually taken over every aspect of her life, always with excuses that seemed real. "He made me doubt my own mind," she said at one point, and the pain in those words was palpable. "And that was the worst total humiliation, not just losing my money or my house, but losing trust in myself." Mark's lawyer tried to break her testimony, tried to find inconsistencies or signs of confusion, but Helen was prepared. Each question was answered with clarity and specific details: dates, amounts, exact conversations. At one point, the lawyer tried to suggest she'd misinterpreted her son's intentions, that Mark was genuinely trying to help her. Helen looked him directly in the eyes and said something that echoed through the room. "Sir, when someone isolates you from everyone you love, controls every penny you have, and threatens to declare you insane if you complain, that's not help. That's imprisonment." The jury was visibly moved. Some had tears in their eyes. And I, sitting there in the back of the room, felt immense pride in this woman who'd been so devalued for so long, but who was now showing the strength she'd always had. The verdict came after only a few hours of deliberation. Mark was found guilty of misappropriation, financial abuse of an elderly person, and coercion. He was ordered to return all the money he'd transferred from Helen's accounts, with interest plus a substantial fine. The criminal case was still pending, but this civil verdict was already a devastating blow. I saw Mark leave the courthouse that day, and he was a completely different man from what he'd been. The arrogant confidence had disappeared, replaced by something that looked almost like disbelief. How had he, who'd been so careful, so meticulous in building his narrative, been defeated by letters his mother had hidden under the floorboards? How had the ungrateful son No, he wasn't the ungrateful daughter. He was the ungrateful son. How had the ungrateful son finally been exposed after years maintaining the perfect farce? Helen went back to her house 2 weeks after the verdict. The for sale sign was removed, and little by little, she started reconquering the spaces she'd been forced to abandon. I helped with the cleaning and reorganization, and it was moving to see how each object that went back to its place seemed to bring a piece of her back too. She decided to hire a part-time caregiver, not because she needed constant supervision, but because it really would be useful to have help with some heavier tasks. But the choice was hers. The control was hers. And that difference was everything. You know what the best part is? She told me one day while we were having tea in her old kitchen. "It's not having the money back. It's not being in my house again. It's being able to trust my own mind again. It's knowing I wasn't crazy, that everything I felt was real. My marriage with Mark, as expected, didn't survive. You don't discover your husband is capable of systematically destroying his own mother and continue married to him as if nothing happened. I filed for divorce right after the civil verdict, and he didn't contest. I think he knew any additional legal battle would only bring more negative attention. It was painful, especially thinking about our children and how to explain all this to them when they were older. But it was also liberating, in a strange way, because I'd done the right thing, even when it was hard, even when it meant destroying my own life to save someone else's. And I don't regret it for a second. Helen deserved to have someone on her side. Deserved to have someone who believed when she said something was wrong. The guilt still visited me sometimes, especially in the middle of the night when I couldn't sleep. Guilt for not having realized earlier, for having been a passive accomplice for so long. For all the times I looked at Helen and thought, poor thing. She's so confused when actually she was desperately trying to communicate the truth. Sarah told me once I shouldn't carry that guilt, that Mark was expert at deceiving people and that even trained professionals had fallen for his narrative. But, still, the guilt was there. Maybe it was something I'd have to carry forever, the weight of having taken so long to see what was right in front of me. But at least now I was doing something with that weight, transforming it into action, into justice, into restitution. Helen and I developed a completely new relationship after all this. It was no longer that uncomfortable dynamic of daughter-in-law and mother-in-law where I never quite knew how to act or what to say. It was a true friendship, built on mutual trust and a deep understanding of what each had been through. She told me stories about her life that Mark had tried to erase, about how she'd been a brilliant teacher before getting married, about the dreams she'd had to postpone when the children were born, about the happy marriage she had with her husband before he passed away. There were stories of a complete and rich life that had been reduced to confused mother in Mark's narrative. And now, finally, Helen had the chance to be seen as she really was. An intelligent, resilient woman who'd survived one of the worst forms of betrayal imaginable and still hadn't lost her humanity. For the first time in years, Helen slept in peace. She told me this in one of our tea conversations, and the way she said it was so simple but so powerful. You know, Laura, I used to wake up in the middle of the night with my heart racing, thinking I'd forgotten something important or done something terribly wrong. I'd spend hours replaying conversations, trying to understand where I'd gone wrong. But now I sleep through the night, because I finally know I wasn't wrong. It wasn't my mind that was failing, it was my son who was failing me. Hearing that broke and healed my heart at the same time. Broke because it represented years of unnecessary torment. Healed because it meant somehow, against all odds, we'd managed to give her back what mattered most, not the money, not the house, but trust in herself, the peace of mind that comes from finally being believed. Helen's story started circulating beyond Willow Creek, catching the attention of organizations that work with elder protection. She was invited to speak at some events, to share her experience, and help others who might be going through the same thing. At first, she was hesitant. After years of being silent, the idea of speaking publicly was terrifying. But she decided to do it anyway, because as she said, if my emotional story can help one person avoid going through what I went through, then it's worth it. And that was perhaps the biggest victory of all, transforming that emotional story of abuse and survival into something that could help others, into something that could prevent other elderly mothers from being silenced and exploited by their own children. Helen hadn't just recovered a voice, she was using it to amplify the voices of others who were still trapped and silent. Helen's decision to tell her story publicly didn't happen overnight. It took months of conversation, of encouragement, of her processing everything that had happened before she felt ready to transform that pain into purpose. I was with her the day she received the first invitation. A local elder protection organization wanted her to speak at an event about family abuse. I saw the fear in her eyes when she read the email, that visceral fear of being exposed, of being judged, of publicly reliving the total humiliation she'd suffered privately for so many years. What if people don't believe? She asked me that afternoon, her voice small, almost like a child's. What if they think I'm exaggerating, or worse, that I somehow deserved it? I held her hands and reminded her of something Sarah had told us. The truth has its own weight, and when you tell it honestly, people feel it. The first event was at a local library on a Saturday morning. It wasn't anything grand, maybe 40 people in the audience, mostly healthcare professionals, social workers, some elderly caregivers. Helen was nervous in a way I'd never seen before, her hands trembling as she held the notes she'd prepared. But when she stepped onto that small makeshift stage and began to speak, something changed. The voice that had been suppressed for so long finally had a microphone, literally, and she didn't waste that opportunity. She told everything from the first signs of control she'd ignored, through the gradual isolation, all the way to the letters she'd hidden under the floorboards as a last act of resistance. When she finished, the silence in the room was so profound you could hear people breathing. And then someone started clapping, and soon the whole room was on its feet. After that first talk, more invitations started coming in. Helen was invited to speak at state conferences on elderly rights, at training sessions for healthcare professionals, even at a public hearing about the need for stronger laws against financial abuse. Each time she told her story, it made a difference. Professionals started paying more attention to signs of excessive control by family members, asking more direct questions to elderly patients when they were alone, not simply accepting the word of dedicated children without independent verification. And other victims started coming forward, people who'd been through similar situations but had never had the courage to speak up because they thought no one would believe them. Helen's voice was literally saving other lives, preventing other stories of abuse before they reached the point where hers had. The house that almost got sold, that almost became the last piece of independence Mark would take from her, became a true home again. Helen hired someone to work on that floor where the letters had been hidden and completely renovated it, not to erase the memory, but to transform it. That space kept my truth safe when no one else wanted to hear it, she explained to me. It deserves to be treated with respect. She even had a small commemorative plaque made that she discreetly placed in that room. The truth always finds a way. It wasn't ostentatious, didn't draw attention. It was just a personal reminder of what that space had meant, of how it had been an instrument of her salvation. Every room in the house started breathing again, feeling alive in a way it hadn't felt in years. Building a relationship of true trust between the two of us was one of the unexpected gifts of that whole ordeal. It wasn't about family obligations or social roles anymore. We were genuinely friends, two women who'd been through something intense together and come out the other side transformed. Our afternoon teas became sacred rituals where we talked about everything about her children besides Mark, who'd grown distant over the years but were now trying to reconnect, about my plans for the future as a single mother, about books, about politics, about life. Helen had strong opinions about everything, and now she wasn't afraid to express them. It was as if all those years of being silenced had created an immense need to finally be heard, and I loved hearing every word that came out of her mouth. One afternoon, while organizing some of her old photos, we found a particularly interesting one. Helen, still young, maybe around 30, holding a Teacher of the Year award with a radiant smile. I asked about that time, and she spent hours telling me about her career as an educator, about the students she'd impacted, about innovative projects she'd developed. You know, she said at one point, with a touch of melancholy in her voice, Mark was always ashamed that I worked. He'd say that a good mother should stay home, that my career was selfish, and I eventually gave in, left everything to be the mother he thought I should be. Looking back, I think that's where it started, when I let him define who I should be instead of defining it myself. It was a powerful reflection, and it made me think about how many women go through similar processes of gradual erasure, starting with small concessions that seem reasonable in the moment, but that add up to a complete loss of identity. The label of crazy that had defined Helen for so long was finally replaced by the truth, not just in court, not just in professional circles, but in the Willow Creek community as a whole. People started seeing her for what she really was, a lucid, strong, resilient woman who'd almost lost everything to her own son, but who'd found a way to resist even when it seemed impossible. Neighbors who used to avoid interacting with her because they thought she was confused now stopped to chat when they saw her in the garden. Many of them apologized for believing Mark's stories without questioning, and Helen, with a grace I never stopped admiring, accepted those apologies without resentment. He was very good at what he did, she'd say. I don't blame anyone for being fooled. I was fooled by him for a long time myself, and he's my son. Helen's relationship with her other children, she had two, besides Mark, began a slow and painful process of rebuilding. They'd grown distant over the years, partly because Mark had fed small fights and misunderstandings, partly because they had their own lives in other states, and it was easy to let Mark take care of their mother while they lived their lives. When everything came to light, they were shocked, feeling guilty for not having paid more attention. The middle son, Robert, flew in from Chicago specifically to apologize in person. "Mom, I should have noticed," he said with tears in his eyes. "Should have questioned more, visited more." Helen hugged him and said something that showed the depth of her wisdom and forgiveness. "Son, you were living your life, as you should. Mark isolated me from you all so subtly that by the time you noticed it was already done. Don't blame yourself. We're here now, and that's what matters." The most beautiful transformation of all was watching Helen discover who she was beyond Mark's mother or abuse victim. She started taking painting classes at a local gallery, something she'd always wanted to do but never had time for. Though the truth was that Mark always discouraged any activity that took her out of the house, that put her in contact with other people outside his control. Her paintings were surprisingly good, full of vibrant colors and raw emotion. At one of the gallery's exhibitions, she displayed a series called Recovered Voices, Abstract Images, representing the process of finding her voice again. One of the pieces showed a mouth being gradually revealed, emerging from layers of shadow. It was powerful, visceral, and told a real story without need. Helen also started working as a volunteer for the organization that first invited her to speak. Now she helped train healthcare professionals on how to identify signs of elder abuse, how to ask the right questions, how to create safe environments where victims could feel comfortable speaking up. It was emotional work, often painful, because it put her in constant contact with stories similar to her, but it was also incredibly meaningful. Every person I help identify the signs early is someone who won't have to go through everything I went. It's someone who won't have to hide letters under the floorboards because nobody believes them. Her work started getting recognized nationally, and she received several awards from elder protection organizations. But for her, the biggest award was each email she received from someone saying, "Your story saved me," or "Because of you, I sought help in time." The voice they tried to hide under the floorboards, that they tried to suffocate with labels of confused and unstable, that they tried to completely erase, hadn't just survived it, was echoing. It echoed in the conference rooms where Helen spoke, in conversations between healthcare professionals who now paid more attention, in laws being proposed to better protect vulnerable elderly mothers, in the lives of other victims who found courage in her words. And every time I saw Helen step onto a stage or simply have tea in her kitchen, telling some story with that animation that had been suppressed for so long, I thought, this is real justice. Not just the verdict in court, not just the money returned, but this a woman recovering her voice, her identity, her life, and using all of it to make a difference in the world. 1 year after everything had started, 1 year scenes, I found those letters under the floorboards. Helen organized a dinner at her house. She invited her children, her grandchildren, some close friends, professionals who'd helped with the case, and of course, me and my kids. It wasn't anything extravagant, but it was perfect. The house was full of life, laughter, conversations overlapping each other in that chaotic and wonderful way that only happens when people who really care about each other are together. At the end of the night, Helen made a toast to true family, she said, which isn't defined by blood, but by who stands by your side when the truth is hard to hear, and to persistence of truth, of justice, and of the human voice that refuses to be silenced. We all raised our glasses, and in that moment, I felt the story had found not an ending, but a new beginning. Because this was never just Helen's story, it was a story about all the voices that are silenced, all the elderly who are discredited, all the truths that are buried, and about how, sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to listen, to believe, and to act. In the end, this real story isn't just about Helen or about Mark, it's about all of us. It's about having the courage to question what everyone accepts as truth, to believe in someone when the whole world says they're wrong. It's about understanding that abuse doesn't always come with screaming and physical violence. Sometimes it comes disguised as care, as concern, as an exemplary son who's actually destroying his own elderly mother in slow motion. Helen recovered her voice, her house, her dignity of it. Above all, she recovered confidence in herself. And that was the biggest victory of all. This emotional story completely transformed me. It taught me that we need to look beyond appearances, question narratives that seem too perfect, and most importantly, always believe when an elderly person says something's wrong, because their voice matters, their story matters, and they deserve to be heard with respect and seriousness. And you? Have you been through something similar? Do you know someone who might be being silenced or controlled by family members who claim to be helping? What would you do if you were in Helen's place, or in mine? Leave your opinion in the comments. I really want to know what you think about this. If this emotional story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss other emotional stories that bring life lessons and make us reflect on our own choices and relationships. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, because sometimes a real story like this can be exactly what someone needs to find the courage to act. Until the next story,